In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the style of pop art. The context for this style is post-World War II, and what was happening during this time was that consumerism was being encouraged as a way to financially rebound from the war, and this was particularly the case in Britain as well as America. Now, pop art worked with the subject matter of the everyday. This is not the same as the everyday that we saw with realism, these heroic and dignified peasants that populated the work of people like Gustave Courbet and Rosa Bonheur. But instead, what we have is pop artists who are working with that which was the most banal, mundane, the most commonplace aspects of everyday life. There's three particular focuses that we see with pop art in this respect. So first, the focus on mass culture. What this is doing is it's looking at the ways in which our cultural values are communicated to us through vehicles such as newspapers, magazines, television, etc. This also includes images of advertisement. 2, popular culture. How does our culture reflect what is popular? For example, what does it say about our culture when we have people like the Kardashians who are famous for no legitimate reason at all? And then finally, we have consumer culture. This considers how we purchase and what we purchase and the amount of objects that we consume and how altogether this reflects who we are as a culture. Now, in this way, pop art was a clear rejection of the growing intellectualism of the artistic climate. Keep in mind, throughout the development of modern art, and we've seen this, art's become more and more intellectual, more and more elite, placing emphasis on complicated concepts that are communicated through highly abstracted or non-representational aesthetics, which was a combination that was really hard for most people to understand. In addition to rejecting intellectualism and elitism, pop art was also very much a rejection of the emotional heroism, the personal expression, which altogether made this style specifically a reaction against abstract expressionism. Now, where we see this most significantly, where I would say this is very apparent, is this fact that pop artists are bringing representation back to art. Now, not only are they bringing representation back to art, but it was imagery that wasn't elite or special, which would be what you kind of would expect when you're thinking about high art or fine art, but instead it was very recognizable, easily understood by most everyone. I don't think it's too much of an intellectual stretch to look at a painting of a Campbell's soup can. Now, this piece here predates the official recognition of the pop art movement, which occurred in the late 1950s. But it's a great image for us to look at as we consider pop art because it's very much an embodiment of the spirit, as well as the visual and ideological aims of this style. The artist here, Paolozzi, he was part of a British group of artists known as the Independent Group. In 1956, some members of this group exhibited their work at the Whitechapel Gallery in London in a show called This Is Tomorrow. This was a really significant moment because it's considered to be the official, institutionalized introduction of the style of pop art. Now, what we see here is a photo montage. This is a material or a process of note in the pop art style for a couple of reasons. First, this is a clear connection between pop art and Dada, with that similar use of the collage, particularly the photo montage. What is a photo montage, you may ask? This is our other point of significance. The photo montage takes its imagery from print media, a source that's very much in line with one of the focuses of pop art, which we've just been talking about, mass culture. So here we have this piece. It's a psychological fact. Pleasure helps your disposition. This is a British critique on what was seen as the shallow consumerism and decadence of American culture. If we look at all that's going on in this image, we can see what Paolozzi is trying to get at. This idea that contentment stems from surrounding yourself with lots of consumer items, that meaningful existence comes from the fact that you own a Hoover vacuum and fancy appliances, And the title reinforces this sense of contentment, as a sort of source of psychological well-being. You want to be happy, you buy a bunch of stuff. But if you look at these images, you can see there's something like kind of not quite right here. This image really is overly artificial. It's overly cheery, almost saccharine. I am sorry, but no one is that happy to vacuum or clean their kids' playroom. Now, because this imagery in this photo montage derives from advertising, it really brings to light the false narratives that are used to encourage people into purchasing things, presenting at least what I see to be an argument that such overt over-consumerism creates an artificial and an empty sense of happiness. Now, pop art as a style originates in England. This is where the This Is Tomorrow show is happening. And the artist Richard Hamilton was one of the first English pop artists. In fact, he's credited with coining the term pop art alongside the art critic Lawrence Alloway. This is a great example of pop art in that it addresses many of the wider cultural constructs that this style aimed to critique. For example, in the photo montage seen here, we've got popular culture advertising, comic books, amongst other elements of mass culture, and consumer culture, and popular culture. What we have here is this sort of fantasy interior that's populated by who the artist intended to be a modern-day Adam and Eve, which I think is a really fascinating message when you think about what the implications of this choice could be. Now, through the items housed in this interior, as well as this Adam and Eve occupants, we see reflected the values of consumer culture, which functions to investigate the same sort of ideas that we saw in the previous slide in Paolozzi's work, that the overconsumption of mass-produced objects and popular entertainment is a source of happiness and contentment. Again, like the other piece, you can see it right here. Vacuuming can be so rewarding, quite fulfilling to the soul, actually, if you simply just have the right kind. So this piece is filled with references to mass culture. You've got mass media with the inclusion of the television, the newspaper, the theater marquee, which is here in the background. Now, with this theater marquee, this is interesting because this is the entertainer Al Jolson. And this entertainer was known for minstrelsy, which is a form of American entertainment where white people would dress up in blackface to create comedic, and I'm doing like those air quote marks right now, comedic performances that were essentially mocking African Americans and their culture. Which here it goes to show that despite living such a modern life, these antiquated views of these different cultures, they still exist. We also have references to consumer culture with all of the brand names. You've got Ford right in here. You have Armour Hams right in here. You've got Tootsie Pop. Now, of course, this phallic placement here, not a coincidence, probably making it a sexual reference. And then we've got references to popular culture as well. Now, the popular culture references are here. You've got romance comics, which were really popular during this time. This muscly guy right here is the bodybuilder Charles Atlas. The woman here is actually cut out from a porno magazine. The planet on the ceiling here is a reference to the popularity and wider cultural interest in space exploration at the time. So all of this taken together presents this social commentary, one that's questioning society's values within this post-war culture that was becoming more and more unapologetically consumerist. Here we have David Hockney. This is another British pop artist, but he had a home in Southern California, so he worked in America as well. And living in Southern California, he was influenced to paint depictions of Los Angeles suburban landscape, which were in many ways these fantasy images, this idea of eternal sunshine with days spent by the pool. A bigger splash, which we see here, is the most well-known of a series of 3 paintings that he did that depict swimming pools. These images function to speak to the dream of material comfort and uncomplicated existence. You get to have a pool in your backyard, which is a reflection of the ultimate consumer object, which is your home, and all the objects that go along with it or inside of it. Where the swimming pool is a site of leisure and a site of comfortable living, and it's also a site of economic privilege as well. I grew up in a house that had a pool, and I know firsthand pools are really expensive and they take a lot of work. The simplicity of the composition, which we see in these repeated geometric shapes and these flat planes of color, reinforce this idea of a simple, uncomplicated existence. We have a clear reference to leisure and enjoyment rather than work or struggle, where you have clean, crisp plains to suggest brightly sunlit, pristine domestic landscape. But yet, just like with Paolozzi's and even with Hamilton's work, there seems to be something not quite right. Again, this cautionary undertone. This is an environment that functions as a location for relaxation and leisure. But what good is all of this if you're all alone? This image is completely void of human presence. We have a splash that merely implies it. Even the backyard environment seems to be absence of human presence. There's no towel or a tasty beverage or a book or any other object that one would probably have alongside them as they spend the day swimming in the pool. So to this end, it's a similar message to that of Hamilton and Paolozzi, that consumer objects cannot replace some of our more human needs, such as socialization, a sense of community. Yet, the way in which this cautionary and perhaps moralizing message is communicated is striking when you consider that this sort of, empty image. Think about this against the intensity of works by abstract expressionist artists like Pollock or de Kooning or Frankenthaler. By contrast, we have work like this, very typical of pop art, that is emotionally restrained. Almost, I would say, to the point of being emotionally indifferent. Now, although pop art originated in England, the movement found its greatest articulation and success in the United States, probably because the United States had an even stronger consumer culture than that of Britain. You've got the artist Roy Lichtenstein here, who turned to comic books to examine American popular culture, where here, and this is typical with a great number of his works, he created an image of something out of a comic book and turned it into a large-scale painting. Now let's talk about these choices for a minute, because they're significant. First, he's taking an image, the type which would be mass-produced, and he's turning it into a painting, right? And remember that the medium of painting is traditionally considered fine or high art. So what he's trying to do is he's trying to bridge the gap between the everyday, the banal, and fine art. And this was the aim of many pop artists. Second, this work is large in scale. We know that traditionally in art, scale is used to convey importance. So with the large scale of this work, Lichtenstein is attempting to convey the importance of the everyday, which functions to undermine that elitism that I was referring to at the beginning of this lecture. Much of the imagery that Lichtenstein produced was inspired by melodramatic romance comics that were extremely popular at the time. To create his paintings, he used the visual vocabulary of the comic strip with its dark, black, thick outlines, flat areas of color, primary color at that, red, yellow, blue. Then he painted, through silk screening, onto his canvases small dots, which, if you look close, you can barely see them, right? All these, it's red right down here in the blue, all of these small dots, which are called Ben-Day dots. The Ben-Day dots mimic the printed comic image, which called attention to the source of this work, a mass-produced image, more specifically, comics. I think there is another point of significance with these melodramatic images. Not a coincidence that this is what he picks. Remember that abstract expressionism was seen as communicating these very serious, heroic expressions of emotion. And in many ways, this kind of over-emotional comic image seems to mock that seriousness, that Andy Warhol is considered to be probably the most quintessential of the American pop artists, certainly the most well known. And what he was especially known for was his silk screen printing techniques, where he would kind of like mass produce these using a whole host of studio assistants in his studio, which was called the factory. So let's think about the wider implications of that for a minute. He made multiple prints of all kinds of objects and people that he identified as the icons of American popular and consumer culture. Now, in 1972, President Richard Nixon made a very famous trip to China. This trip was important. It was a very delicate diplomatic dance because it was the first time that the West was going to officially recognize China since the Communist Revolution of 1949 that put the leader of China, Chairman Mao, into power. Because of the diplomatic implications of this visit, because this was a big deal, and I know that we can understand this because we see this in our media all the time, the media just like totally focused on this, and it was like all anyone ever talked about. So with all of this focus on Chairman Mao, it became perfect subject matter for Andy Warhol. Warhol was very much focused on popular culture, and he was very interested in the way that fame was constructed, the ways in which you could constantly repeat an image, and that repetition made it banal. It made it every day. By repeating something over and over and over again, it's no longer special, it becomes devalued. Repetition to the point that the identity of a person, a celebrity, really was not even relevant anymore. Repetition, just simply focusing on visual appearance, which would facilitate superficial consumption. So Warhol's known for making all sorts of these repeated images of celebrities. Marilyn Monroe probably is his most famous. He made these images of Elvis, Jackie Kennedy, to name a few. Now I chose, even though there's more famous examples, I chose Chairman Mao because I think this work possesses an interesting relationship with the propaganda that had been distributed by Chairman Mao. And it hinges on that same idea of repetition. So Chairman Mao, when he was in charge of China, and he was a dictator, he would put all these images of himself all over China. And of course, and you can see this here, right? It's very dramatic, it's very theatrical, with the intent to encourage passivity, to simply encourage people to follow along this great leader, super heroic, right? And this idea of just simply following along, it's not too far off from the message of consumerism that was being promoted in American mass, consumer, and popular culture. So Warhol does the same thing that Mao was essentially doing, repeating an image. But what Warhol did, which I think was interesting, is he kind of subverted these images by making Mao appear almost flamboyant. He wears colorful clothing, and then he looks like he's wearing makeup. And by doing this, he, in a very simple way, very straightforward yet very effective way, robs Mao's image of authority and power. He demonstrates that power, especially when it's being so insistently communicated, is actually quite tenuous. So we've looked at pop collage and painting. Let's take a look at an example of sculpture with Claes Oldenburg's Floorburger. So Claes Oldenburg created all kinds of sculptural works of food and other everyday objects as a means to explore contemporary everyday existence. Specifically, our everyday existence in terms of our relationship with food. I think this is powerful because food as a consumer object has very particular significance. I might even say that we almost have like an intimate relationship with this consumer object because we put it into our bodies and it has the ability to directly impact our health. Now, what we're seeing here is a type of sculpture that Oldenburg was well known for, which was called the soft sculpture. These were sculptures that were made of canvas or vinyl, and then they were sewn together. And then they were stuffed to give this work like a pliable, stuffed appearance. Now, technically, it was wife who did all the sewing, but it's Oldenburg, of course, who receives all the credit. So, by creating a work like this, he wanted to change the ways in which we see the everyday and to question relationship that we have with the everyday. He created a giant hamburger, right? We've got a person here to give us a sense of scale, 4 by 7 feet. This giant hamburger that's exaggerated to the extent that it's almost vulgar, where something that most people would find appetizing is now kind of gross and unappealing. The hamburger is like soft and squishy, which is not the ideal consistency for this cuisine. It's overly thick, it's roughly textured, looks soggy, and it has, though, this very strong presence through its large size. Now, again, it's the same as this Lichtenstein situation. Large size to convey importance, right? So the irony here, the humor, the pun, is that the significant object is a hamburger. Is this a pun? Actually, when I consider our culture and the popularity of fast food, elevating the importance of a hamburger doesn't actually, to me, seem too far off the mark.